Today we're running through the technique around answering the Macbeth question. Ordinarily this would be on literature paper 1, but for your mock exams you have a combination of Macbeth and poetry, which would ordinarily be in literature 2. But the timings remain the same. So you have an hour and 45 minutes for this paper, and as in the real exam, that means that you have roughly 50 minutes to respond to this question. And the format is also the same. So, as you'll get in the real exam, for the Macbeth question, you'll have a short extract taken from the text. In this one, I've chosen Act 1, Scene 2, just because it's an obvious one, and I know we'll probably need a bit of revision on the captain's speech. And you then have a question based around, hopefully, one of the themes that we've already identified and you've already revised. In this case, violence. The things to bear in mind before starting your planning even is to read the question carefully, read the extract carefully, and then bear in mind that it does say starting with this speech. So when you're planning your answer, you do need to pay attention to the speech and reference it at the beginning of your essay. That doesn't mean necessarily that your first paragraph has to deal with this. It could do, but you would need to maybe reference this in the introduction, where it sits in the narrative. The other point is that you need to be using this. This is it's free marks, effectively, because you can take your evidence and find literary devices in this passage, and you probably want to be looking at maybe 30% of your overall response, at least in terms of the close analysis that you're doing, coming from this passage. So we can very quickly run through this, and then we'll spend a separate short video doing our planning. So first of all, in your introduction, I would be ready to explain where this sits in the text. And when it comes to violence, this is perhaps a slightly strange one. We should know that for any number of other questions, if it comes to morality or fear or perhaps ambition, any of those core themes, we will probably want to make the point that at the beginning of the narrative, Macbeth starts off as an honourable, decent man, and it's not until later that we see his ambition, his loss of control, his fear take over. Violence, on the other hand, is interesting because Macbeth is introduced as a violent character, and it's one of the few ways that Shakespeare foreshadows his downfall. So if we have a look at the extract, the first thing that we should bear in mind before we get into close reading is just that this represents Macbeth at the start of his journey, when he remains an honourable, decent man. And it's also worth pointing out that violence, in this instance, could be read actually as a strength in this society. You might remember that when it comes to Aristotle's tragic hero, we first of all look for something called megalopsychia. Now, you don't necessarily need to remember that for your exam, but what you should remember is the modern definition of that, and that is that tragic heroes have something great about them. So megalopsychia is greatness of spirit, and in order for us to pay attention, to be interested in this character, and also for their downfall to have some kind of cathartic resonance, they need to have the opportunity to be good or even great. So let's go through the captain's speech. He starts off describing the battle itself and the fact that it was by no means a sure thing. Doubtful it stood as two spent swimmers that do cling together and choke their art. So he describes the battle using the analogy the metaphor, the simile, to be more precise, as two spent swimmers, as being slightly pathetic. And also upsetting in a visceral sort of way. We start off with this image of two desperate people clinging together, almost as if drowning. The merciless MacDonald, worthy to be a rebel, for to that the multiplying villainies of nature do swarm upon him. Well, we haven't got a question on the supernatural or on ambition, but if we had, it would be worth pointing out that we establish MacDonald in opposition to the natural order, almost as some kind of supernatural evil, the multiplying villainies of nature swarming upon him, almost like a biblical plague. From the western isles of kerns and galaglasses is supplied, and fortune, on his damned coral smiling, showed like a rebel's whore. So again, back to the natural order, it's as if fortune itself has been turned by the merciless MacDonald. But all's too weak, for brave Macbeth, well he deserves that name, disdaining fortune with his brandished steel, which smoked with bloody execution, like a Valis minion, carved out his passage till he faced the slave. Now there are a few points here. The main point to be clear on before we go forward is the idea of conflict in Macbeth's character. On the one hand, he's brave Macbeth, he's a hero, and he's described also as Valor's minion, meaning if you were to personify courage, he is bravery's servant. So he is aligned with the natural order, and a heroic character at the start of the play. Having said that, we do get the early sort of very delicate foreshadowing of what the butcher that he is eventually going to become. So we have smoked with bloody execution, and again, quite visceral, violent imagery. The word smoked as well carries an interesting connotation, something that you might associate with fire, maybe even hell. And then as it continues, which ne'er shook hands nor bade farewell to him, till he unseamed him from the nave to the chaps, and fixed his head upon our battlements. And again, an upsetting image, and the word unseamed in particular, meaning split open roughly from the navel, so from the hip bone to the chaps to the jawbone. Quite a disturbing image. And there is something impersonal and brutal in the way this is described. So, where would we begin with this? Well, we'd start off by making the point that Macbeth is doubtless presented as a violent character here, but at this point in the play, it's by and large seen as a strength, as an aspect of his courage, and it is in no way in conflict with his loyalty to the crown, to Duncan. If anything, it's what makes him such a valuable servant to the king. We do also have the early signs of what's to come, and some of the brutality that we'll later see from the character.